Chapter 1. The Governess and the Gentleman. The Cotswolds, with its rolling hills and quiet beauty, was a land of peace. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, and the worries of the world felt like distant echoes. For Lucy Taylor, it was both a sanctuary and a cage. Lucy had been a governess for the previous 2 years, tending to the needs of Lord Henry Ashford's children in his grand country estate. The children, young Thomas and Emily, were bright and well-mannered, but they were also as curious and mischievous as their father was distant. The household ran like clockwork, but it was the kind of place where the emotional temperature was set by the mood of one person, Henry. She had heard the whispers when she first arrived. "Lord Henry's heart is cold," the maid had said. "He's lost in the past, and nothing will make him warm again." At first she hadn't believed them. After all, Henry was a man of undeniable charm, even if it was veiled by a perpetual frown. His eyes, a dark shade of brown, often looked distant, as though his mind was perpetually elsewhere, hidden away in grief. Yet, beneath that hardened exterior, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to him than the sorrowful man who walked the halls of Ashford Manor. Henry Ashford, the heir to the Ashford estate, had moved to the Cotswolds to escape the weight of London. The memories of his late wife, Clara, lingered in the corners of his heart, and every morning when he looked out across the estate, he felt the sting of her absence anew. It had been just over a year since her passing, and although the Cotswolds had granted him peace, it had not cured his heart. The wounds of the past remained fresh, even as the seasons changed around him. For weeks, Lucy had kept her distance, doing her best to fulfill her duties while remaining invisible. She had come to terms with the fact that she was no more than a governess in Henry's eyes, another cog in the well-oiled machine of his estate. She was no one of consequence, certainly not worthy of the attentions of a man like him, and yet she couldn't stop the fluttering in her chest whenever their paths crossed. His gaze, though often cold, would linger for a moment too long, and Lucy couldn't help but wonder if there was more to that fleeting connection than she dared admit. As she walked the corridors of the grand estate that morning, she couldn't help but notice the crisp air that heralded the arrival of autumn. The leaves outside were beginning to turn shades of gold and amber, a sight she had come to love. It was in moments like these, when the world was bathed in soft light, that Lucy allowed herself to dream of a life outside the constraints of her role, a life where she might one day be seen, truly seen, as someone worth more than just a governess. But those dreams were fleeting, as fragile as the leaves outside. "Miss Taylor, if I may have a word," a soft voice called from behind. Lucy turned to find Mary, the housemaid, standing at the doorway, her face etched with concern. "Of course, Mary," Lucy replied, offering a small smile. The maid stepped closer, her voice lowered to a whisper. "I know you've been spending more time with his lordship. I just want you to be careful." Lucy frowned, unsure of what Mary meant. "Be careful? What do you mean?" "I mean, don't get too close," Mary said, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "Lord Henry, he's not the man you think he is. He's mourning, miss, and nothing will ever make him love again." Lucy's heart tightened at the words. She had heard the rumours, of course, how Henry had never quite recovered from the loss of his wife Clara, but she had never thought of him as someone incapable of feeling anything but sorrow. In fact, there were moments when Lucy thought she caught glimpses of something deeper beneath his cool exterior. Could it be possible that the man who seemed so far removed from the world still longed for connection? "I appreciate your concern, Mary," Lucy said softly, though her heart ached at the thought. "But I am only here to do my duty. Nothing more." Mary gave her a wary look. "Just don't let him break your heart, miss. Not like he did Clara's." Lucy watched as the maid retreated, her words hanging in the air. "Not like he did Clara's." Chapter 2. Unspoken Words. The weeks following Mary's warning passed in a blur for Lucy. She threw herself into her duties, focusing on the children and doing her best to keep her distance from Lord Henry. However, the more she tried to keep her heart locked away, the more it seemed to rebel. There was an undeniable pull between them, an invisible thread that seemed to tug at her whenever Henry was nearby. She found herself constantly looking for moments where their paths might cross, times when she could steal a glance at him, when his gaze might, for just a moment, linger on her. One crisp autumn morning, Lucy was walking with the children in the expansive grounds of Ashford Manor, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of the day ahead. They were heading toward the orchard, the trees heavy with ripe apples ready for picking. Lucy smiled at the sight of Emily's excitement, her little face lighting up as she eagerly tugged at her governess's hand. "I want the biggest apple, Miss Taylor, the biggest one," Emily exclaimed, her eyes wide with determination. "We'll see what we can find, my dear," Lucy replied warmly, bending down to ruffle the child's hair. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her, the familiar chill in the air that always seemed to accompany Lord Henry's approach. She straightened, her heart racing as she turned to face him. There he stood, his tall form framed by the towering trees, his gaze fixed on the trio of them. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was something in the way his eyes softened when they landed on the children. "Miss Taylor," he greeted her, his voice low, yet with a hint of warmth. "I see the children are enjoying the fresh air." Lucy nodded, trying to maintain her composure, though her heart fluttered in her chest. "They are, my lord. The orchard is lovely this time of year." There was a long pause, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread, ready to snap. Henry shifted slightly on his feet, as though he were uncertain of what to say next. It was clear that his grief still held him captive, his eyes distant, his jaw tight. "Are you well?" Lucy asked before she could stop herself. Her voice was soft, almost too soft, but the words tumbled out before she could call them back. Henry met her gaze, his expression flickering with something vulnerable that he quickly hid behind his usual stoic mask. "I am fine," he said curtly, though there was a certain sadness in his tone that Lucy couldn't ignore. "You don't have to be fine all the time, you know," she said before she could think better of it. The words hung between them, bold and unspoken, a gentle invitation for him to let down his walls, if only for a moment. Henry's gaze sharpened slightly, his brow furrowing in a way that made Lucy's heart race. "You think too highly of me, Miss Taylor," he replied, his voice colder now, as though her words had touched a raw nerve. Lucy hesitated, unsure of how to respond, but before she could say anything else, Emily tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Taylor, look, I found the biggest apple," Emily beamed, holding up a red apple nearly the size of her small hand. Lucy smiled at the child, grateful for the distraction. "Well done, Emily. Now let's make sure we save some for later." Henry watched them for a moment, his eyes lingering on the scene with a faint expression that Lucy couldn't quite place. Was it admiration, or perhaps something more? "I'll leave you to it," he said, turning away before she could respond. But just before he left, he paused. "Thank you, Miss Taylor," he added, his voice quieter now, "for your care of the children." Lucy blinked in surprise at the sincerity in his words, the softness in his tone, unlike anything she had heard from him before. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but as he walked away, her heart skipped a beat. What was happening between them? Chapter 3. The walls begin to crumble. Days turned into weeks, and the chilly autumn wind began to hint at the coming of winter. Lucy's connection with Henry remained unspoken, but undeniable. She found herself thinking about him more often, puzzling over the small moments that had passed between them, his subtle glances, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to the children, the quiet kindness he sometimes showed when he thought no one was watching. It was on a particularly cold evening that the shift in their relationship became impossible to ignore. The children had gone to bed, and Lucy was sitting by the fire in the sitting room, knitting quietly. The sound of the door opening made her look up, and there, standing in the doorway, was Henry. He had shed his usual cold, detached air, replaced with an almost fragile weariness. He hesitated for a moment, as though unsure whether to enter. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "May I speak with you?" Lucy set her knitting aside, her heart racing as she nodded. "Of course, my lord, what is it?" Henry stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room was bathed in the soft glow of firelight, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. He stood before her for a long moment, his gaze uncertain. He faltered, clearly searching for the right words. "I have been difficult, cold. I know this, and for that, I apologize. It has nothing to do with you." Lucy's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him, stunned. She had never heard him speak so openly, so vulnerably. The walls he had so carefully built around himself seemed to be crumbling, piece by piece. "I don't understand," Lucy murmured softly, her heart aching for the pain he was clearly still carrying. "You've been through so much, but why do you push everyone away?" Henry's eyes flickered with a mixture of sadness and guilt. "Because it's easier to push people away than to risk letting them in." He paused, his voice thickening. "I lost my wife, Miss Taylor, Clara, and ever since I've felt as though I've been drowning, lost in a world that no longer makes sense. But when I look at you, when I see how you care for my children, how you make them laugh and feel safe, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time." Lucy felt her heart soften at his words, a part of her aching for the man who stood before her, broken, yet so deeply human. "Henry," she whispered, his name a breath between them. "I never thought I could feel this way again," he confessed, his voice barely audible now. "I never thought I could open myself to anyone else after Clara. But you've done something to me, Miss Taylor, something I cannot explain." Before Lucy could respond, Henry took a tentative step toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. The space between them felt electric, charged with emotions that had been simmering for far too long. Chapter 4: The tension grows. The days that followed Henry's unexpected confession were filled with a new, fragile tension between Lucy and him. Though his words had been heartfelt, Lucy wasn't sure how to respond. She had spent so long in her own world of shyness and quiet longing that the reality of what Henry had just shared left her feeling both elated and uncertain. Henry had spoken of his late wife, Clara, in a way that made Lucy realize just how deep his pain ran. It wasn't simply the grief of losing someone he loved. It was the part of him that had been frozen in time since her passing. It was as though every piece of him that had once been open and free had locked itself away, determined never to experience that kind of heartache again. But now, something new had stirred between them, something unspoken, yet powerful. Henry seemed more present these days, though still guarded. There were moments when their eyes would meet across the room, and Lucy would catch the same tenderness in his gaze that had flickered there the night of his confession. On a crisp November morning, the children were playing in the garden, their laughter echoing through the halls of Ashford Manor. Lucy had found herself by the fireplace again, the warmth of the flames an odd contrast to the chill that still lingered in her heart. She thought about the events of the past few weeks, how Henry had come to her, vulnerable and broken, and how she, too, had begun to open up to him in ways she hadn't allowed herself before. Yet, she still couldn't shake the doubt that lingered in her mind. Was Henry simply finding solace in her presence because she was there? Was it merely a passing affection born from his loneliness, from the hole that Clara's death had left in his heart? Before she could settle deeper into her thoughts, the door to the room opened, and Henry stepped inside. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice firm yet soft, the way it had been during their earlier conversations. "I need to speak with you again." Her pulse quickened. She had been preparing herself for this moment, knowing that it would come, but she hadn't expected the flood of emotion that surged within her when their eyes met. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady, but her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it, my lord?" Henry closed the door behind him, taking a step toward her. "I've thought a great deal about what we spoke of the other evening," he began, "about how I've been so cold and distant. I realize now that I was pushing you away in a way that I hadn't even fully understood until you looked at me that night. I don't want to do that anymore, Lucy." His use of her first name made her breath catch in her throat. He'd never said it like that before, soft, tender, almost as if it were a secret shared between them alone. "I don't want to be the man who hides away from the world, from you, because I'm afraid," Henry continued. "I don't want to be afraid to let you in." Lucy swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "But you have been, Henry. You've kept everything locked inside for so long." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I can't change the past, but I want to change what happens now. I don't want to push you away any longer. I've come to realize that I care for you more than I ever thought possible." The words hung between them, fragile and delicate. Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She had known it deep down. She had felt it in the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd opened up about his pain. But hearing it aloud, from him, was something entirely different. "I care for you, too," she said softly, her voice trembling as she spoke the truth she'd been holding inside for so long. "I've always cared for you, but I didn't think someone like you would ever—" She stopped herself, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Someone like me?" Henry asked, his tone curious but gentle. Lucy hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "You're so different from me, Henry. You're wealthy and powerful, and I'm just a governess. I come from a family with nothing. How could someone like you—" Henry stepped forward, lifting her chin so that their eyes met. "Lucy, don't you see? I don't care about any of that. All I care about is you, your heart, your kindness, the way you've cared for my children and for me. You've brought light into a life I thought was lost in shadow, and I want to be with you. I want to spend my life with you." The room seemed to hold its breath as Lucy's heart swelled with emotion. Tears filled her eyes, and she didn't try to stop them. She had been afraid that her love for him would never be returned, that her position in his world would always keep them apart. But now, all the fear, all the doubt, melted away. "Henry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what to say. I've loved you for so long, but I never thought you could ever feel the same." He smiled softly, a smile that reached his eyes, softening the shadows that had once dominated his face. "You don't have to say anything, Lucy. I've already heard everything I need to hear." With that, Henry gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had fallen. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss that spoke of healing, of newfound hope, of everything that had been left unsaid between them. It was a kiss that made Lucy's heart soar and her doubts vanish. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt truly seen and truly loved. Chapter 5. The Confession and the Future. Days later, Henry and Lucy stood side by side in the gardens of Ashford Manor. The autumn air had grown colder, but their warmth was enough to ward off the chill. The children played nearby, their laughter a sweet symphony in the background, as Henry took Lucy's hand in his, the promise of a future together shining in his eyes. "I never thought I would find love again," Henry admitted quietly. "But with you, Lucy, I feel as though I've found everything I've been missing. You've healed a part of me that I didn't even know was broken." Lucy smiled, her heart light. "And I never imagined I could be loved by someone like you, Henry. I never imagined I'd be able to share a life with you." He brought her hand to his lips, brushing a soft kiss against her knuckles. "Then let's start our life together, Lucy. Let's build something beautiful, for the children, for us, for everything." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of happiness. "I would like nothing more," she whispered. And in that moment, standing beneath the vast open sky of the Cotswolds, surrounded by the beauty of the world they would share, they knew that this was only the beginning of their story, a story that would be filled with love, joy, and the promise of a future built on the foundation of healing hearts and shared dreams. Epilogue. A new beginning. Months passed, and the cold winter turned to spring. Lucy and Henry had married in a small, intimate ceremony in the village church, surrounded by close friends and family. It had been a day filled with warmth, love, and a sense of peace that Lucy had never known before. Henry had moved beyond the sorrow of his past, finding new purpose in the love he shared with Lucy. Together, they raised their children in the peaceful Cotswolds, where the air was always filled with the scent of fresh flowers, the sound of birdsong, and the laughter of those they loved. As they walked hand in hand through the fields one sunny afternoon, Lucy looked at Henry, her heart full. "I never imagined I'd find such happiness, Henry. He smiled down at her, squeezing her hand. "And I never imagined I'd find someone like you, Lucy. You've made my world whole again." And together, they walked forward into their future, their hearts united, their love unbreakable, the end.